Please give a warm welcome to Lord Andrew Adonis.
Thanks very much, Frank, and thanks for the huge positive work you do in networking and bringing us all together to discuss what is one of the most important challenges facing the country, which is how do we turn our most dynamic centres of population and business, our cities, into real powerhouses for the future. It's also great, by the way, this is the largest physical gathering I've been in for 18 months, and I hope it's the first of many. When I was Transport Secretary, for reasons I can't begin to fathom, they called me the Thin Controller. Now that fortunately I'm responsible for nothing at all, and I'm not on the Labour front bench either, I don't need to talk in euphemisms, though I didn't do much of talking in euphemisms even when I was a minister. And I always used to say when I was in those jobs that my middle name was no complacency. So I want to try and set out what I regard as the challenge. And you heard a session which I thought was very good with the chief executives of three of the biggest cities outside London. The three biggest cities outside London and the city of Coventry. And I thought the conversation was good. And I thought Tony at the end from Liverpool was particularly good on the massive inequalities that we face. But I think we need more of a sense of what are going to be the drivers of growth and how we seize them in the future. Because the truth and the reality, not being euphemistic, is that for our cities outside London, the last 50 years has been pretty bad, and the generation after the war saw systematic decline and big increases in relative poverty compared to other parts of the country in those cities. The last generation, it's stabilised. The big challenge now is whether there can be growth. Let me just read you some figures, because statistics always bring things home. This is the population of the city of Liverpool over the last century. 1900, 700,000. 1930, when it was known as the second city of the empire and was hugely successful centre both of industrial production, but also trade, 850,000. By 1970, one generation later, it had gone from 850,000 down to 600,000. That's a decline of 30% in one generation. 1970 to 2000, down to 435,000. That's down another 30%. Population halved in 60 years, the city of Liverpool. Today, 20 years later, it's 500,000. It's gone up from 435 to 500,000. So it's stabilised and gone up a bit. It's almost exactly the same for Manchester. It's a bit better for Birmingham, and that's in the context of a substantial move of population across England as a whole, from the north to the south. The only region that has systematically grown in terms of population and economy in England over the last century is London and the southeast. All of the others have suffered significantly. It's also, Tony said at the end, that the only city whose productivity was higher than the national average, apart from London, was Bristol. It's also the case that Bristol is the only city outside London in the country that has average income that is higher than the national average too. However, park that for a moment. So a story for every large city outside London of relative decline, and in some cases massive decline over the last 50 years, which has stabilised. London, meanwhile, has taken off. London's population in 1900 was 7 million. It reached a peak of 8.5 million at roughly the same time as Liverpool, just before the Second World War. It then also went through a decline, not as serious a decline, but a pretty serious decline too, down to 6.5 million in the early to mid-1980s. Now, though, it's 8.7 million. London's population is now larger than it's ever been. Its economy is larger than it's ever been. The gap between London and the economies of the other regions and other cities is greater than it's ever been. It's also the case, though, because let's boast about our successes too, London's position relative to the other major cities of the world is stronger than it's ever been too. So if you look at it, you know, the famous Charles Dickens book, A Tale of Two Cities, what you've actually got is the tale of two Englands at the moment. You've got a phenomenally successful powerhouse of London and the South East. That's not to say it doesn't have the deprivation challenges that Tony talked about. A third of the poorest wards in the country are in London and the towns immediately around it, but it's in the context of a fundamentally strong and growing economy, strong vis-à-vis its national economy, but also crucially strong vis-à-vis its international economy. Now, what is the bedrock of it? We had a lot of discussion earlier about deprivation, and that's important, but you can only ever tackle deprivation and generate success in cities if you have fundamentally strong sources of production. Unless you have a strong industrial base for centres of population, they go into very, very rapid decline. And the figures I gave about the cities are much worse for the towns of the north. There is a major crisis afflicting about a third of the towns of the north, whose industrial basis has largely vanished over the course of the last 50 or 60 years. Now, all of that's important, because I'm only speaking for 10 minutes, because when I was in government, the two things I really sought to do, there's so much more we should have done, and as I look back on it, a lot of wasted opportunities, but I think we got some of the analysis right, is that what we needed to do was to sort out the really poor quality of public services in this country, which was chronic a generation ago, and I think we did a fairly good job of that. But when it came to the productive economy, I don't think we did enough outside London and the South East. And London and the South East, which was a phenomenal success story, built substantially around business and financial services, was a pre-existing strength. London has been a major financial centre going back to the 17th century, the foundation of the Bank of England in the reign of Charles II. You know, these things have deep and long cultural roots. But London fundamentally reinvented itself in the 1980s and 90s. It fundamentally reinvented itself on the basis of the Big Bang, the massive deregulation of business and financial services that took place. It fundamentally reinvented itself by a massive increase in the quality and quantity of its business and housing stock. Michael Heseltine, who's a great hero of mine, and I emulated to some extent what I sought to do, essentially created a second city in London, in Docklands. A phenomenal success story there. And also, London got the lion's share of the benefit of membership of the European Union as well, which was a phenomenal success story for London and the South East, because its economy essentially integrated with Europe, as well as being able to develop much larger international markets too. Now, when I was at transport, because infrastructure is such a fundamental part of all these things, my philosophy was extremely simple on the big things. There were a lot of small things, and I had railway companies that were going bust, all kinds of things which can overwhelm you, and I'm afraid to say for many ministers, they totally overwhelmed them. But the big strategic thing that I sought to do, and which I'm glad to say was a large part of the conversation earlier, was to export the success of London to the other regions of the country. That fundamentally is what HS2 is about. Other countries without economic geography, almost without exception, apart from the United States, have high-speed rail links which link their major conurbations. And they've done it over the last 2 generations. The first serious high-speed rail links were opened by Japan for the Tokyo Olympics in 1964, so 2 generations ago now, linking this phenomenally important economic corridor of Tokyo, Nagoya, and Osaka, which is not that dissimilar from London, Birmingham, Manchester, and Glasgow as an economic corridor. 3 big conurbations, in our case, 4 big conurbations, all with a significant city in the middle, with huge connectivity and transport challenges between them. All of the other major countries with economic geographies of our own, besides the United States, built high-speed rail links over the next generation. Italy started in the 1970s, France, Germany, the Netherlands, Belgium, Spain, Taiwan, all of those, all in the 1980s and 90s. China now has more high-speed rail than the rest of the world put together, and its big spine of Beijing to Shanghai is one of the great economic corridors of the world. Meanwhile, what did we do? We privatized our rail system. We had a complete catastrophic breakdown in the operation of our most important non-road system of transportation over a generation. And we started to patch and mend over the generation after the 1990s, but anyone who used the West Coast Main Line in the 1990s and 2000 when the supposed upgrade was taking place, which led to it becoming a virtually non-functioning entity for the best part of a decade, knows that we didn't fix it at all. So what was the vision of HS2? It was to transform connectivity between the strongest and largest centre of economic activity and population in this country, which is Greater London and the South East, and the other conurbations of the country, which desperately needed transformed connectivity with London. Hence, what is the big spine of HS2? London, Birmingham, Manchester, Leeds, though the government unfortunately has got a big question mark over Leeds now, and then up to Glasgow and Edinburgh. It was transformed connectivity between them and transformed capacity between them too. Because if you've got rising population and rising business activity, then you need transformational capacity. And the two forms of capacity that we need to transform in terms of our infrastructure are digital infrastructure. Hence, we need properly functioning 4G going on to 5G. We're well behind much of East Asia in the development of 5G at the moment. Our 4G coverage is deplorable. The latest survey I saw has England rated 30th in quality of 4G, consistent quality of 4G coverage in the country. And of course, our fibre coverage is very patchy. When I was chairing the National Infrastructure Commission, which I did in the mid-2010s, I saw the biggest challenge after getting HS2 done was to sort out the digital infrastructure challenges. And our cities now, city leaders, I noticed actually in the conversation we had just now, none of them mentioned digital connectivity. If I was the chief executive or leader of one of these major cities, one of the biggest things I would be doing, which means I'd be doing something about it every day and banging on the door of the government, Ofcom, and the big telecoms companies, is to get transformed fibre and mobile digital coverage. And I would want, if I was the chief executive of any of those cities, I'd want to be a 5G pilot, and I'd be banging on the door of the government to get special schemes set up so that they could become so. And I would be sending delegations out to look at what's already happening in Japan and Korea in respect of 5G pilots and digital connectivity. Finally then, HS2. The plan for HS2, I'm glad to say, is going ahead. There's been a lot of sound and fury. It hasn't been well managed. It's been delayed, but it is going ahead. There are 250 construction sites between London and Birmingham at the moment. The plan is for it to be open by 2026, 2027. The four key stations on the line of route that will be opened in the first phase: Euston, Old Oak Common, which will be the interchange with the new Crossrail line, which is due to open in 2 years' time, delayed but will open. And a fundamental part of the conception of HS2 was the connectivity between HS2 going north-south and Crossrail linking east-west in London. Because, of course, it's end-to-end connectivity that matters in terms of transport and infrastructure systems, and particularly for business travellers. With the combination of HS2 from Birmingham Curzon Street or Birmingham International down to Old Oak Common, going across a platform, a 2-minute interchange into Crossrail, it will be from central Birmingham to the west end of London. It will be precisely 1 hour. It will be 1 hour, 10 minutes to the city and 1 hour, 15 minutes to Docklands. All of those journey times are between a half and a third of existing journey times. And the convenience of that connectivity. Have you tried, remember pre-pandemic, tried getting onto the Victoria line at Euston at 8:30 in the morning? Sometimes the platforms are literally closed because you can't get down there because the capacity isn't there. Now, this is an absolutely phenomenal opportunity for you, starting to work out what will be possible in terms of the potential of HS2, moving stuff out of London in a really serious way and relocating, because the travel time from central Birmingham to central London will be less than the travel time from central Brighton to central London, less than, it'd be easier to get from Birmingham International Airport. Indeed, the chief executive of Birmingham International Airport told me 10 years ago, maybe it's probably a different guy now, so I'm probably not embarrassing him by telling you that the great opportunity of HS2 was that he could rename Birmingham International Airport London Birmingham International Airport, because in terms of connectivity, it will be closer than Gatwick and Stansted, in terms of the actual journey time to get off the plane, onto the train, and into central London. The opportunities that this connectivity brings are phenomenal. The big missing link at the moment, though, is the connectivity between the major cities of the Midlands and the North. And that is a massive missing link. HS2 will deal with some of it. When HS2 gets up to Manchester, connectivity between the Northwest and the West Midlands, which has historically been terrible because the Victorians built all their railway lines as direct railway lines by separate companies to London, which is the reason why Birmingham is essentially a branch line off the West Coast main line. And it takes as long to get from Manchester to Birmingham by train, as many of you will know, as it takes to get from Manchester to London, because of the construction of an infrastructure system that's 200 years old. Because the fundamental conception of HS2 is London, Birmingham, Manchester, linking the three conurbations. Every Manchester train will go through Birmingham. They will all stop at Birmingham International Station. So the connectivity of the Northwest and the West Midlands will be fundamentally transformed by HS2. But that is not going to be the case with Yorkshire, because the government's not proceeding with the extension of HS2, which is a fundamental strategic mistake for the country. They're not proceeding with the extension to the East Midlands, Sheffield and Leeds. And also, of course, they still have no plan for east-west connectivity, which is fundamentally important. Liverpool, Manchester, Bradford, Leeds, Newcastle, Hull. When I was chairing the National Infrastructure Commission 6 years ago, put forward proposals for HS3 going forward. They're not happening at the moment, and the reason they're not happening is that people can't agree on a route, and there isn't a Transport Secretary who, alas, is doing what I was seeking to do, which is actually doing the planning themselves. And the Treasury is absolutely delighted that nobody can agree in the North on what the route should be, because the last thing they want to do is to have to fund it. They've spent the last 10 years trying to kill HS2. They haven't succeeded in doing that. To give him his due, partly because of the Prime Minister, because the Prime Minister does believe in big infrastructure of this kind, and the key decision 18 months ago to proceed with HS2, he took overruling Dominic Cummings. So he is in favour of this. The Treasury is slightly worried that if there an actual scheme which has agreement in the North through this opaque body called Transport for the North and the mayors getting together, if it could actually be generated, the Prime Minister might support it and the Treasury might be forced to do it. So those of you who have serious business and political connections in the Midlands and the North, getting a plan together for east-west connectivity across the North would be a pretty good thing to do, because it's taken 20 years so far. There still isn't one. And when the Chief Executive of Manchester said that the big battle which the Mayor of Manchester is having is about Manchester Piccadilly stations, whether it should be an end station or a through station, this is an entirely academic debate until there is a plan for a route that goes east-west. And there isn't a plan that goes east-west at the moment, which is why this train, which apart from my own name is the most misnamed thing in the world, which is called the Trans-Pennine Express, that is slower in linking the great cities of Manchester and Leeds than trains linking any other two cities of their proximity in the continent of Europe. Why that is not being sorted is because there still isn't a plan. So there are great opportunities here. HS2 is a phenomenal opportunity for business relocation, improving connectivity and growth, but there are great challenges too, and we shouldn't be complacent, because the truth of the reality of the situation in England outside London is of relative decline, in some cases precipitate decline over the last 2 generations, constant movement down to London and the southeast, a stabilisation of the situation in respect of the major cities, but it's precarious. Their economic and productive bases are still weak, particularly once you take higher education out of the agenda. And to end where I began, I think our motto should be no complacency. Thanks very much.
Outstanding as ever. Thank you very much for the contribution. Listen, let me start off with a general question about government's approach, of all colours, and a seeming reluctance to invest in infrastructure, because you've mentioned transport and obviously the railways, but you've also mentioned digital. Your experience is extensive within the corridors of Westminster and Power. Where does the resistance come from?
Well, there is, the Treasury doesn't like, I mean, the job of the Treasury, as it sees it, is to prevent money being spent. You know, it's a financial control department. It doesn't see itself as an economics department to invest. So there's this constant struggle between the two, and very occasionally you get a chancellor who actually wants to invest, which horrifies the Treasury officials, and they do their best to try and stop it. We had one of those in Gordon Brown, who was pretty keen on investment, and indeed HS2 wouldn't be happening, let me say, without Gordon, because he was Prime Minister then, and I was his Transport Secretary, and he completely got and completely understood both the politics and the economics of HS2. He also, by the way, understood the importance for Scotland. If the union between England and Scotland is going to survive for the next generation, it's going to have to be partly on the basis of much, much stronger economic and connectivity links between the two, and having decent rail connections. It takes at the moment nearly 5 hours to get from Glasgow and Edinburgh to London by train. There's no reason why that should be the case if you had 21st century infrastructure rather than 19th century infrastructure that we've got at the moment. So he completely got it. George Osborne got it up to a point too, hence the Northern Powerhouse, the decisions to proceed with HS2, which the Treasury was keen to stop, but he didn't. But that's the exception, not the rule. So the Treasury is always an obstacle, and it requires strong ministers, strong civic leaders who are able to make the case for their conurbations effectively. By far the strongest civic leader we've got in this country, by far, wasn't on the platform earlier. Of course, it's the Mayor of London. The Mayor of London, who is elected with an electorate of 6 million people, you know, the Prime Minister is a former mayor, by far the most visionary civic leader we've had in the last 25 years in this country was Ken Livingstone, who largely reinvented London's infrastructure, created Transport for London, which is the most effective public transport system of any conurbation in the world as it's developed over the last 20 years. So they're important too, but half of our infrastructure, including the entirety of our digital infrastructure, is entirely funded by the private sector. And that is a very big challenge, because the role of government in respect of all of that investment, BT, fibre, mobile infrastructure, is as regulator, and the key regulatory agency whose importance is massively underestimated in the provision of infrastructure at large in this area is Ofcom. And Ofcom has given far too much priority over the last 25 years to consumer prices, which of course are important. You want competitive markets and you want to be bearing down on prices, but it's given far too little importance to infrastructure and to infrastructure investment requirements and rollout requirements and service level requirements on providers. And the government has stood back and not really engaged with Ofcom on this as it should, but nor have civic mayors and business leaders, because I don't think they sufficiently understand that the regulatory body and all of the licenses that it issues are what determine investment levels. The rollout of 5G and dealing with this crisis that we have over a large part of the country in 4G, the state body that could change that in the course of a year to 18 months would be Ofcom, if it had a chief executive and a chair who were absolutely focused on that issue. It has a chief executive who's reasonably good. It hasn't had a chair. There isn't a chair of Ofcom at the moment. There hasn't been for a year. You may, if you read the newspapers carefully, be aware that there's a massive battle going on as to who should be the chair of Ofcom, because the government wants Paul Dacre to be the chair of Ofcom. Now, let me let you into a secret. I know Paul Dacre quite well. I don't think digital infrastructure is high on his list of priorities. Having culture wars is extremely high on his list of priorities. Exporting the Daily Mail to the country at large and having more of its ethos in the BBC, that's very high on his list of priorities, which is the reason why Number 10 is so keen that he should be appointed. But the single most important thing he will do as chair of Ofcom, if he's there, or whoever is the chair of Ofcom, is to regulate the rollout of next generation digital infrastructure. And whether it's him or whoever is ultimately appointed, focusing them and getting business leaders, civic leaders, and hopefully the bits of the government that isn't obsessed with fighting a culture war to focus on that will have an enormous impact on the growth of our economy over the next 20 years.
Okay. You mentioned, I think this will have come as in equal measure disappointment and surprise to many in the audience, particularly from the Northwest, that the regional mayors in the North haven't got a plan for what we're now describing as Northern Powerhouse Rail. And given the fact that you've got transport for the north, given that you've got 3 very powerful mayors now in terms of the cities of Leeds, Liverpool and Manchester, and then of course you've got Ben Houchin in Teesside, who's making a bit of a name for himself. Why have those guys not got their heads together and come up? Is there, again, a role for the private sector to start to apply a little pressure as far as that's concerned, do you think?
I think there probably is. These are all, in their own way, political big beasts. Let me let you into a secret. Political big beasts don't much like collaborating with each other. It's what comes of being big beasts. You tend to want to keep apart. They come from different political parties. One of them would much rather be leader of the Labour Party than the mayor and all that. So you've got a lot of things going on here. But also, you always, in politics as in life, need to strip away the verbiage and understand the reality. They all give speeches. Indeed, if one of them was here today, they would give a speech about the importance of Northern Powerhouse Rail, how they're looking forward to the plans being taken forward and all of that. But they are not themselves applying the pressure or doing the spade work that would make it happen. And what you need to be saying to them is, excuse me, where is the plan for Northern Powerhouse Rail? You know, it's 2 years. This thing called the integrated rail plan, because there's also, you need to strip away the jargon too. The integrated rail plan, as it's called, which was supposed to be the plan for what's going to happen to the north, was due to be published at the end of 2019, then in June 2020, then at the end of 2021. In the middle of this, the end of last year, in the middle of this year, it hasn't appeared, and it's not in the offering at the moment. There is no plan. There's a plan to have a plan. There's been a plan to have a plan for the last 20 years. Generally speaking, it's a good idea to have a plan, not just to have a plan to have a plan. And you might, when you meet any of these mayors, start asking them where the plan is, rather than the plan to have a plan. Because the reason why London is racing ahead is London's mayors, who integrate in themselves, because there is only one mayor for the whole of this conurbation of 8.5 million, and they've got this hugely professional and dynamic organisation called Transport for London that does it. It exudes plans. Crossrail is opening next year, and that it should have opened 2 or 3 years ago, and if it had, the impact that this would have had without a pandemic on the growth of London would be enormous. Crossrail itself will add 10% to the public transport capacity of London. That is one piece of infrastructure. It will create entirely new cities out of Reading, Slough, and Shenfield, the 3 big places it serves going east and west. These will be the new Docklands, but with massive housing too, and 2 of them with big universities as well. There's nothing like this in the works at all in the north. One of the things I did, ironically, for Boris when he was mayor, was I did the plan for Crossrail 2. There is a plan for Crossrail 2, which is the north-south equivalent of Crossrail 1, going east-west. The only thing holding up that plan is that the government at the moment won't fund it. Actually, part of the reason it won't fund it is because of the levelling up and rebalancing and all of that. It sort of thinks it should do something in the north before it does Crossrail 2. But if I had to give you a prediction, once we get a mayor of London who's seriously committed to next generation infrastructure, once that happens, London will be banging the drum very, very loudly for Crossrail 2. It will have the plan. And if there isn't the plan for HS3 ready to go by then, the next big infrastructure thing that will happen after HS2 will be Crossrail 2 in London. It won't be an infrastructure scheme for the north. So the stakes are extremely high here. There's a massive absence of civic leadership. There are a lot of people with some fairly good ideas around, but there isn't real driving force. And you're absolutely right, Frank, to say that there isn't the collaboration that's needed to make the sum more than the parts.
Okay. We focused inevitably on your passion for transport. HS2 was your big idea, but I know you also have a huge interest in education, some great reforms that you led. Again, many people in this room now will be talking about recruitment issues, lack of skills, training needs not being met. Again, can I get your perspective on where we are as far as that particular agenda is concerned? And of the reforms that you did make, what were you most proud of? Where do you think we perhaps didn't go far enough And were there any mistakes in those changes that were made?
Well, I don't know where to begin on the mistakes. But generally speaking, I don't admit to my mistakes before meetings of 300 people. So if you'll forgive me, I won't go into great detail in those. But there are three bits of the education system that really matter to a functioning economy: the school system, the vocational training system, and the university system. And to wildly overgeneralise, to give a short answer, we have had made a phenomenal success of our university system over the last 20 years. It is genuinely world class. We have the best university system of any country of our size in the world. And in terms of citations in learned journals, volume and quality of research, numbers and productivity of students and all of that, we're up there with the United States. That's a great success story. It was some very tough choices. Introducing tuition fees, which was a large part of the reason why this happened, because we completely reinvented the funding of universities and put it on a much more generous and sustainable basis, which wouldn't have been possible without tuition fees. It also enabled us to radically increase student numbers, which wouldn't have happened otherwise. That was a very difficult reform. I remember talking at an election meeting of a friend of mine standing in a university constituency in the 2005 election, just after we'd introduced the fees, and saying, on my tombstone will be engraved the words, tuition fees, and somebody shouted out from the back, not soon enough. You just need to think about that for a moment. But you will have noticed that none of the governments that have come since have abolished tuition fees. On the contrary, the government that came in 2010 trebled them, which is much more than I would have done, by the way. It was a very brave thing to do. But as I look back on it, it was probably the right thing to do in terms of really giving a powerhouse effect to our higher education system. And the decisions to increase research funding in universities and have much more competition for research funding and all of that, that's been a huge success. So our university system, allowing for the fact that, of course, graduates do need to get decent jobs and all of that, though by and large our graduates do get jobs, and by and large they get highly productive jobs, though, in parenthesis, note that half of all graduate vacancies, half, are in London. So it's having a big sucking effect into London, the expansion of higher education. But for the UK PLC, it's been a phenomenal success story. When it comes to the vocational training system, though, it is dire, absolutely dire in this country. Compare our apprenticeship system, the skill levels, the employment levels, and the productivity of those going through vocational training in this country with the Netherlands and Germany, and they could be one could be first world and one could be third world. The difference is so great. Whereas in universities and graduate level employment, our productivity is higher than in those countries. Lots of Germans want to come and study and do their degrees here. I haven't yet met a German apprentice who thinks it would be a great idea to move country and come here. So great is the contrast. Apprenticeship numbers are in precipitate decline at the moment. That's amazing, given how weak they were to start with. The government introduced a thing called the apprenticeship levy 5 years ago, whose main effect has been to reduce the number of apprenticeships. So that's not a great link between policy and outcome, and that needs to be sorted. So there's a big, big problem there. Our further education colleges are by and large led by very well-intentioned people, but they are not economic powerhouses in their localities, as you will probably all attest, in the same way as universities are. We need our further education sector to be much more like our university sector in terms of its engagement with employment markets, value added, and being world-class. The school system is a curate's egg. Our private school system in this country is phenomenally successful. The best of our state school system is good, but there is far too long a tail of poor schools and very low levels of achievement. And I regret to tell you the story of the last 15 years in that respect, in terms of the tale of poorly performing state schools, has been transformation in the case of London and the South East, and only incremental improvements outside London, particularly in the major cities and towns of the Midlands and the North. Now, I could give a long explanation as to why that is the case, but that again is having the effect of pulling London and the South East and the rest of the country apart. Relative educational performance between London and the South East and the rest of the country is relative performance. The differential is expanding at the moment, and that ought to be a source of very great concern in the Midlands and the North.
Andrew, thank you. Right, we've got time for 2 or 3 questions from the audience. If anybody wishes to put a question, can you just indicate and I'll come to you? Yeah, Tom?
I'd like to ask about durations for major investment programmes. You know, you see the time it takes to come forward, cost of bidding. I've done some very significant bids myself. I did in Sellafield, it took 3.5 years to come forward. You look at the cost of it, then also the decision making for things to come forward. So Heathrow, the third runway, Crossrail itself took a long time to come forward. You know, all these major investment programmes at a time when we need the investments in the country. And it's fine saying Treasury likes to kill these things off, but actually they need to be quicker. Surely needs to be shorter, less costly. And then the other comment I would add is PFI, while it's a dirty word, at a time when government doesn't have money, it's a way of bringing investment back in again. And we need to look at new sources of investment in major infrastructure. So there's a few things in there.
Thanks, Chris.
I completely agree with both of those points. The time it takes to get projects going, the political risk and uncertainty, the propensity of one government to try and reinvent the wheel and all of that is a really, really serious and debilitating factor in the development of infrastructure. That's definitely true. And on your second point, PFI got a bad name for a good reason, which is it became far too bureaucratic. I mean, some of the PFI contracts, you know, the Treasury didn't get a proper grip on that. But the PFI concept of public-private partnership and also building in the revenue costs into capital projects and integrating them, so you don't just provide the capital and then there isn't proper maintenance, which was a perennial problem of the provision of public infrastructure in this country in the generations after the war, all these dilapidated schools and hospitals which have been built and they're not properly maintained. The underlying rationale for PFI was sound, and I think getting the best of the PFI concept without the bureaucracy is something the government should be addressing urgently. Yes, it was, and I regret that it wasn't started in the north, because if it had been started in the north, building down from Manchester and Leeds, I think this would have made it appear as it is, because, you know, 200 of the 300 route miles, if the whole of the Y was built, Leeds, Manchester to Birmingham and then down to London, 200 of those route miles will be in the north. But people think it's largely a project for the Midlands and the South. So for political reasons, I greatly regret that we didn't start building it from the north. For engineering and logistical reasons, it obviously makes sense to build it from the south, because the big bottlenecks in the transport system are all coming out of London. And so the urgent need for capacity enhancement and additional connectivity is London to Birmingham, and that also hugely benefits everywhere else further north, because they all come into that funnel. So there were very good engineering and logistical reasons for starting in London and building north, but of course psychology is what matters so much to all things in life, and the psychology of HS2, unfortunately, is too much of it being a southern project rather than a northern project. And if we'd started building it from Manchester and Leeds rather than from London, then psychologically people would have understood it as a northern project, which it is in terms of its main benefits. And of course, if we'd started building from both Manchester and Leeds, then it wouldn't have been possible for government to cancel the branch going to Leeds, which is what they're now going to do as a cost-saving measure, which will do, possibly in economic terms, irreparable damage to the eastern side of the country. Because just so you understand, because it's always as well to keep these things simple, when HS2 is completed, the journey times between the major cities of this country will be as follows. London to Birmingham, half an hour. Half an hour. Just think about how that's going to change the country. London to Manchester, 1 hour. London to Leeds, because it doesn't have HS2, 2 hours. London to Newcastle, which also won't have HS2, 3 hours. Now, where is the economic and social activity of this country in a generation's time going to congregate with those figures? You don't need to be a rocket scientist to work that one out, do you? And that is all because of the political decision being taken now to cancel the eastern leg of HS2. It will have irreparable social and economic consequences for this country, and I hope it's possible to persuade the government to change its mind on that, but if they don't, then it's going to be a very bleak economic future for Yorkshire and the North East, particularly for the North East, which of course geographically is further away to start with. So it has even more need for this enhanced connectivity.
Thank you. Right, I'm conscious of the time, so there's two people who've indicated, is that, anybody, come on, I'm going to take...
Should I take those three together? And then,
yeah, please. So, we'll start with you, yeah?
Sorry, Davidson from Lloyds. There's been this commitment from governments around moving departments, officials and decision makers out of London to the regions. But HS2 give them a reason to get the train back to London and actually fundamentally stay in the South East, and will that make a difference?
Okay. Lady at the back. Yeah.
Zoe Metcalf from Atkins. We're living in a post-COVID world. Our children are 13 today. Are going to be 22 when we get to 2030. They're aware of the role of health and well-being, living in green environments, We're seeing migration out of country. We will have superb digital infrastructure by 2022. So my question, where is the voice of the next generation in this conversation? Because we're living in a world where we're talking about how things have been and the future is very different. And I do wonder whether therefore, is there an element of fear around this role in the future if we do invest in infrastructure, or absolutely has to happen? But where is that future generation thinking the voice of our children today and grandchildren tomorrow?
Thank you. Final one, Peter.
Lord Adonis, I agree with your statement about strongly industrial-based fundamentals to economic climate of cities. So I'm surprised that I have not heard about investment in hydrogen technology. Just like to understand your view on that.
Well, I'm in favour of it, is the answer. What its benefits can be and how you can integrate hydrogen into transport systems is a great debate taking place, as you know, at the moment. But obviously it's desirable to see more investment. And I think the government could give a lead, in terms of sponsoring research and projects, partnership projects with universities and so on, in respect of that. I'm strongly in favour of moving public enterprises out of London in a serious way. I even proposed that the House of Lords should move out of London. Do you know how many of my colleagues in the House of Lords supported that proposal? It wasn't large, but of course once HS2 comes, it'd be possible to get to these other places very quickly, and actually it'd be much quicker to get to London for most of the country, to Birmingham for most of the country with HS2 than it would be to get to London. So I hope actually HS2 might make it possible to move even more out. I'm strongly in favour of it. What's tended to happen in the past, of course, as you're aware, is that back office stuff has been moved out, but no serious government department has moved out. And until you actually get front of office stuff moving out, and not just back of office stuff, this devolution agenda won't make the impact that it could. And on the voice of the young, I couldn't agree more. It's not just that then their voice isn't being heard in infrastructure. Their voice isn't really being heard in the debate about the future of the country at all at the moment. We have far too little youth engagement in politics. Turnout of young people in elections is pitiful. I'm personally in favour of reducing the voting age to 16, having a polling station in every school, and registering every young person to vote in their school so that it becomes a culture, because all of the evidence, the political science evidence, is that the people who vote in their first election after they become of voting age then always vote. Those who don't never vote thereafter. So instilling a culture of civic engagement and voting and participation, including lots of young councillors and all of that, from the age of 16, I think is hugely important, but it hasn't happened. And to return, because I never make a speech without mentioning Brexit, 'cause it's one of the most disastrous things happening to the country at the moment. The sole reason why this country left the European Union is because the voice of the young wasn't strong enough. If young people had voted in anything like the numbers that the over 60s voted, there would have been a decisive majority against Brexit. A decisive majority. Under 25s are 8-1 against Brexit. They don't want to be shut up on a continent with Nigel Farage and Boris Johnson for the next 30 years. They want to be able to live, work, study. One of the chief executives earlier said that their vision for Manchester, she said, was that it should be a city where people want to love. Well, we want people to be able to forge relationships across the whole of Europe. There is not a good, bright, dynamic future for this country shut off from the rest of our continent. This Brexit issue has not gone away. We're only in the early stages of it at the moment. And the voice of the young is what will determine this in future. And the louder it can be expressed, and the more that we do to facilitate it, the better and the more self-confident and the more open and dynamic a society we will be. There we are.
Zoe, red card. We nearly got to the end of the session without the B word being mentioned. We never would have done it with him. Listen, I know you've got to get off for your train. I'm going to ask a very, very quick question. You've worked with the three of them, Boris, Gordon and Tony. Give us a quick pen pick of each of them. And who would you choose, I think I probably know the answer to this, in terms of leading us out of the pandemic over the next decade or so?
Well, the acid tests, because I could give a prejudiced answer to this. I want to try and give you an objective answer. The acid test to anybody who holds any job, any of the jobs you hold, the jobs I've held, and it applies also to the job of Prime Minister, is did you leave the organisation you were in charge of better at the end than at the beginning? Not did you get everything right, because we're humans and we make massive mistakes and all of that, but did you overall make things better or worse? Now, if you applied those tests, Tony Blair emphatically left the country better than he found it. Britain was a fundamentally stronger, more economically prosperous. Our public services were transformed. All of that after his 10 years. The jury's out on Gordon. He had this big economic catastrophe that happened in year one. I think he did a reasonable job of managing it over the next 2 years, but nonetheless, it was things were worse at the end than at the beginning, but he didn't have that long. I can't, how can I put this diplomatically, confidently predict that the country is going to be in a better condition at the end of the Boris Johnson premiership than at the beginning. But it's work in progress. And if he listens to all of you and downtown and your advice on what should happen about rebalancing the economy and getting the productive capacity of the Midlands and the North going, then maybe he can retrieve the situation.
Big brain and diplomatic. Give Lord Adonis a round of applause, please.